Welcome to another exciting episode of Floppy Deep Dive, where we'll delve into the world of vintage gaming and compare two of the most iconic systems of their time. And in this new series, I'm going to pit the legendary Commodore 64 against the ever-popular Nintendo Entertainment System. And we're going to be taking a closer look at 7 classic games and exploring the strengths and weaknesses of each of these systems. And by the end of the video, you'll have a clear idea of which system and games reign supreme. So please sit back, pull up a chair, grab a joystick as we embark on this epic journey through gaming history. And let the games begin. Get ready to experience one of the many showdowns between the Commodore 64 and the NES.
Now we're going to be doing a side-by-side comparison of the Commodore 64 and NES version of A Nightmare on Elm Street. Two completely different games despite sharing the same name. The graphics in the Commodore 64 version are relatively simple, but the game has a creepy atmosphere with eerie sound effects and music that adds to the horror theme. The controls are a bit clunky though, and jumping can be challenging, especially when you have to navigate through narrow platforms or avoid hazards. Now let's move on to the NES version developed by Rare and released in 1989. And this game's also a platformer, but it has a different gameplay mechanic. You play as a single character, and instead of fighting enemies directly, you have to collect items to maintain your health and avoid falling asleep, which would transport you to Freddy's dream world. And the graphics in the NES version are more detailed than the Commodore 64 version, with larger sprites and more varied backgrounds. And the music's more elaborate and fitting with the horror theme, although the sound effects are a bit repetitive. And the controls are more responsive than the Commodore 64 version, and jumping is easier, although the game can still be challenging. Afterburner is a classic arcade game that was ported to various home systems, including the NES and C64. While both versions are based on the same arcade game, there are some significant differences between the two. Let's start with the NES version. It was released in 1989, and it was developed by Tengen without Sega's permission, which means it's an unlicensed version. And the game's presentation is minimal, with no options and no main menu screen. You go straight into the action, and this is a stripped-down presentation. And the NES version is also notoriously difficult. You only have 3 lives and no continues, making it challenging to progress beyond the early levels. If you manage to reach the later stages, you'll be considered a king of the arcade. The C64 version is more polished and forgiving, and the NES version is faster and more challenging. So which one do you prefer to play? It's all based on personal preference. So now we're going to be doing a side-by-side comparison of the classic arcade game 720 Degrees on 2 different platforms, again, the NES and the Commodore 64. So this was first released in 1986. 720 was a skateboarding game developed by Atari Games. It was popular in the arcades, and it got ported to various home systems. And now we're going to take a closer look at the gameplay of these two systems. First up, we have the NES version of the game. And as you can see, the graphics are a bit simpler than when you might have seen it the arcade version, but it still manages to capture the essence of the game. And the gameplay is pretty faithful to the arcade version, with the same objective of performing, the stunts and collecting coins to earn points. Now let's look at the Commodore 64 version. Right off the bat, you'll notice that the graphics are a bit more detailed than the NES version, with more vibrant colors and smoother animation. And the gameplay is once again very similar to the arcade version, with the same objectives and challenges. Of course, both these versions fall short of the arcade original in terms of graphics and sound, but that's to be expected given the limitation of the hardware at the time. So that's it for the side-by-side comparison of 720 Degrees on the NES and the Commodore 64. Which version do you prefer? Today we're going to be diving into 1942, the iconic vertical scrolling shooter game released by Capcom in 1984 NES. So let's start by comparing the gameplay of the two. The Commodore 64 version music's based on the main verse of Ron Goodwin's 633 Squadron movie score, arranged by Mark Kuksky, and it has a colorful and detailed graphics that take you back to the 80s. And on the NES, the graphics were smoother and the animation made it feel much more polished. And I found the NES version much easier to control, and I didn't die so often. But overall, 1942 is a classic game that arcade goers and home console players loved. It was Capcom's breakout hit, eclipsing the popularity of the company's preceding 3 titles that they made. It was the first game in the 1940 series, which spawned 5 sequels over 13 years. So if you're a fan of classic shooters, then you don't want to miss out on playing 1942. So now we're going to be putting 1943, the Battle of Midway, to the test on both systems. So just sit back and relax and let's dive into this retro game. So let's start with the Commodore 64 version of 1943. The game was released in 1988, developed by Capcom. It features the top-down aerial combat with intense gameplay and great sound effects. However, the graphics are a bit limited compared to the NES version, but that doesn't take away from the fun of playing this game on the Commodore 64. The controls are responsive and easy to learn, and the power-ups keep the game interesting as you progress through each level. But overall, the Commodore 64 version falls a bit short compared to the NES version. Now let's switch over to the NES version of 1943, released in 1987. This game also was developed by Capcom, but the NES version has better graphics, more detailed sprites, and smoother animations than the Commodore 64 version. The music is catchy and the sound effects are spot on, and the controls are just as responsive as the Commodore 64 version. But where the NES version really shines is in its power-ups and overall gameplay, and the game is just more polished and fun to play. So in conclusion, while the Commodore 64 of 1943 is a solid game in its own right, it falls short compared to the NES version. So next we're going to be looking at Alien 3 on the NES and Commodore 64. It was released in 1992, and it's a side-scrolling action game based on the movie of the same name. And while the game was released on multiple platforms, overall the Commodore 64 version provides a more challenging and immersive gameplay experience compared to the NES version. When it comes to graphics, the C64 version of Alien 3 clearly outshines the NES. The C64 version features detailed and colorful graphics with smooth animations, while the NES version had a simpler graphics and limited color palettes and blocky sprites. And the Commodore 64 version also featured cutscenes and cinematic sequences that added to the overall presentation of the game. And both versions of Alien 3 features similar sound effects and music, with the NES version having simpler audio compared to the Commodore 64 version. And the Commodore 64 version features a more immersive and atmospheric soundtrack that complements the game's tense and suspenseful moments. And Alien 3 received mixed reviews upon release, with critics praising the game's graphics and the sounds, but criticizing the gameplay and the difficulty. And the NES version of Alien 3 received lower scores compared to the Commodore 64 version, with critics citing its simplified graphics and lack of challenge as a reason for the lower score. So next we're going to be looking at Alien Syndrome for the NES and Commodore 64. And let's start with the graphics. As you can see, the NES version has a more vibrant and colorful palette, while the Commodore 64 version has a more subdued and realistic color scheme. Now let's talk about gameplay. Both versions are similar, with the player controlling Ricky and fighting off waves of aliens to rescue comrades. However, the NES version has some gameplay changes that makes it easier to navigate, such as fewer enemies on the screen at a time, while the Commodore 64 version has more enemies on the screen, making it more a challenge. It definitely was harder. And in terms of level design, both versions have different layouts, but the NES version has more varied and imaginative level designs with more of a diverse backgrounds and obstacles to overcome. And in terms of control, both versions feel responsive and intuitive, with smooth movements and firing mechanics. However, the NES version has a slightly advantage in the area with more precise controls and smoother animation. And overall, both versions of Alien Syndrome have their strengths and weaknesses. The NES version has a vibrant graphics and upbeat music and more varied level designs, while the Commodore 64 version has smoother animations, more detailed sprites, and more challenging. Which version do you prefer? Let me know in the comments.
And that's a wrap on our C64 versus NES Showdown. I hope you enjoyed revisiting these classic games with me and comparing the two systems side by side. And now it's your turn to weigh in. Which system did you prefer for each game? Let me know in the comments below. And if you want to see more videos like this, hit the subscribe button and give the video a thumbs up. And if you're going to support me and help me create more great content, check out my Patreon page and buy me a cup of coffee. Every little bit helps. And remember, if you're new to my channel, there are plenty of other videos to explore, so don't stop here. Click on the next one and let's continue this gaming journey.